In the dusty heart of New Mexico territory, a simple act of mercy changed everything. Callie Jenson was just a quiet ranch hand who minded her own business and worked sunrise to sunset without complaint. But one blood-soaked night, when a dying gunslinger collapsed in her barn with 11 bullets in his body, she made a choice that would cost her everything she knew. With nothing but a sewing kit and steady hands, she fought through the darkness to save a stranger's life. By morning, she was jobless, homeless, and marked as an outlaw's accomplice. The mysterious man vanished, leaving only a silver coin and a debt of gratitude. 24 hours later, that debt would transform her quiet existence into something she never imagined. What she didn't know was that the bleeding stranger she'd saved was no ordinary drifter. He was the most dangerous man the government had ever turned loose on the frontier. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun climbed over the mesa's edge, casting long shadows across the Garrison ranch like fingers reaching for something just out of grasp. Callie Jenson had been awake for 2 hours already, her calloused hands working through the familiar routine of feeding the horses and mucking stalls. At 28, she moved with the quiet efficiency of someone who had learned that being noticed meant being vulnerable. Her small frame belied the strength in her arms as she hefted another bucket of oats. The other hands called her Mouse behind her back, not out of cruelty, but because she had a way of disappearing into the work, becoming invisible among the larger, louder men who dominated ranch life. She preferred it that way. Invisibility was safety, and safety was all she had left in this world. The bunkhouse where she slept was separated from the main quarters by a good 50 yards a deliberate distance that reminded her daily of her place in the ranch's hierarchy. She was the only woman among 15 hands, a fact that Mr. Two-Fifth Garrison had reluctantly accepted when she'd shown up 3 years ago with nothing but the clothes on her back and a willingness to work harder than any 2 men combined. "Morning, Mouse," called out Jake Morrison, the ranch foreman, as he strode past carrying a coiled rope. Jake was one of the few who treated her with something approaching respect, though even he maintained the careful distance that ranch protocol demanded. "Boss wants the north pasture checked for strays. You up for a ride?" Callie nodded, wiping her hands on her worn leather chaps. "I'll saddle up Dusty." Dusty was her horsewell, technically Mr. Garrison's horse, but the old mare had taken to Callie with a loyalty that spoke of mutual understanding. Both had been discarded by their previous owners and had found refuge in work and quiet companionship. The north pasture stretched for miles, a rolling expanse of scrub grass and scattered cottonwoods that marked the boundary between the Garrison spread and the vast wilderness beyond. Callie had ridden this route hundreds of times, but today felt different. The air held a tension she couldn't name, like the moment before a thunderstorm when every living thing seemed to hold its breath. As she rode, her thoughts drifted to the small wooden box hidden beneath her narrow cot. Inside lay her most precious possessions, a faded daguerreotype of her parents, a letter from her sister that had arrived too late to save either of them, and a sewing kit her mother had given her on her 16th birthday. The kit was worn now, its brass fittings tarnished, and its leather case soft with age, but the needles were still sharp, and the thread still strong. Her mother had taught her to sew with the patience of someone who understood that a woman's skills might one day be all that stood between her and starvation. Gentle hands can do more than strong ones sometimes, her mother had said, guiding Callie's fingers as they worked a particularly difficult stitch. Remember that, child. Sometimes the gentlest touch can save a life. The memory brought a familiar ache to her chest. Her parents had died of fever when she was 22, leaving her alone with her younger sister Emma. They tried to make it work, 2 women trying to run a small homestead in Kansas, but the drought had been merciless, and the creditors even more so. Emma had married the first man who'd asked, a traveling salesman who'd promised to take care of her. Callie had watched them leave on a wagon headed west, knowing she might never see her sister again. That was 6 years ago. The last letter from Emma had come from California, full of hope and talk of gold strikes and new opportunities. Then, nothing. Callie had written dozens of letters to the last address she had, but none had been answered. Sometimes she wondered if Emma was dead, and sometimes she wondered if that would be easier than imagining her sister had simply chosen to forget the past. The sound of cattle lowing brought her back to the present. She found the strays easily enough, 3 young steers who'd wandered through a gap in the fence line, drawn by the promise of greener grass on the other side. It was always the same with cattle. They'd risk everything for the illusion of something better, never understanding that the grass was the same everywhere, just viewed from a different angle. As she herded the steers back toward the main pasture, Callie caught sight of movement on the ridge above. A lone rider sat silhouetted against the sky, too far away to make out clearly but close enough to set her nerves on edge. In this country, unknown riders usually meant trouble of one kind or another. She watched for a moment, but the figure remained motionless, and eventually she turned her attention back to the cattle. The ride back to the ranch house took her past the small cemetery where Mr. Garrison's first wife was buried. Martha Garrison had died, giving birth to a son who'd lived only 3 days, and the loss had turned Thomas Garrison from a hopeful young rancher into a hard man who saw sentiment as weakness. He'd married again within a year, a practical arrangement with a widow from town who'd brought her own children and her own sorrows to the ranch. Second Mrs. Garrison had tried to befriend Callie when she'd first arrived, offering her a place at the family table and suggesting she might help with the household duties. But Callie had learned long ago that accepting charity came with strings attached, and she'd politely declined, choosing instead to eat with the other hands and sleep in the bunkhouse. It was a decision that had earned her Mr. Garrison's grudging respect, if not his warmth. The ranch house itself was a sprawling adobe structure that had grown over the years as the Garrison fortunes had risen and fallen. The original building had been a simple 2-room cabin, but success had brought additions: a proper kitchen, a parlor for entertaining, bedrooms for the children who'd never come. Now it stood like a monument to dreams that had been scaled back to fit reality. As Callie rode into the yard, she noticed a buggy she didn't recognize, hitched near the front porch. The horse was lathered with sweat, suggesting its driver had been in a hurry. Through the parlor window, she could see figures moving about, and the sound of raised voices carried on the evening air. She unsaddled Dusty and rubbed her down, taking her time with the familiar ritual. The mare nickered softly, pressing her velvet nose against Callie's shoulder in a gesture of affection that never failed to touch her heart. Animals, she'd learned, were more honest than people. They didn't pretend to feel what they didn't, and they didn't withhold affection out of spite or social convention. Jake Morrison emerged from the ranch house as she was finishing with Dusty, his face grim. "Callie, you best stay close to the bunkhouse tonight. We got word there's been trouble in town, some kind of shootout near the saloon. Sheriff's asking questions about strangers, and Mr. Garrison's got his hackles up." She nodded, unsurprised. Violence was as much a part of frontier life as dust and drought, and it had a way of spreading like wildfire once it got started. "Anyone hurt?" "3 dead, couple more wounded. Word is, it was some kind of professional job, not your usual saloon brawl." Jake's eyes were worried. "Point is, tensions are running high, and Mr. Garrison don't want any trouble finding its way to his doorstep." Callie understood the subtext. As the only woman on the ranch, she was seen as both an asset and a liability. Her presence kept the other hands in line to some degree, but it also made her a target for certain kinds of men who saw a woman alone as fair game. Mr. Garrison tolerated her because she worked harder than most and caused less trouble than many, but his tolerance had limits. As darkness fell, she made her way to the bunkhouse, a long, low building that housed the unmarried hands. Her quarters were at the far end, separated from the others by a thin partition that provided privacy, if not soundproofing. She'd grown accustomed to the snoring, the occasional argument, and the general restlessness of men who lived without the softening influence of home and family. Her sewing kit sat on the small table beside her cot, its brass clasps gleaming in the lamplight. She'd been mending a tear in her work shirt, a task she'd been putting off for days. As she worked, her mind wandered to the stranger on the ridge. Something about the way he'd sat his horse had seemed familiar, though she couldn't place why. In a land where most men slouched in their saddles, this rider had maintained perfect posture, as if he'd been born to command. The sound of approaching hoofbeats interrupted her thoughts. She set down her needle and listened as the rider drew nearer, the horse's gait irregular and labored. Something was wrong. She'd heard enough wounded animals to recognize the sound of an exhausted horse being pushed beyond its limits. Through the thin walls, she could hear the other hands stirring, their voices low and cautious. Someone was coming to the ranch at an hour when honest travelers were bedded down for the night. In this country, that usually meant trouble. Callie extinguished her lamp and moved to the small window that faced the main yard. The moon was nearly full, casting enough light to make out shapes and movement. She watched as a lone rider approached the ranch buildings, swaying in his saddle like a man barely conscious. The horse beneath him stumbled, its head hanging low with exhaustion. As the rider drew closer, she could see that something was terribly wrong. His shirt was dark, with what looked like blood, and he seemed to be having trouble staying upright. The horse, a fine bay gelding that had clearly been ridden hard, finally stopped near the water trough, its sides heaving. The rider tried to dismount but collapsed instead, falling heavily to the ground where he lay motionless. Callie waited, expecting to hear the other hands emerge from their quarters, but the bunkhouse remained quiet. The man's collapse had been silent, and the thick walls had muffled any sound he might have made. She knew she should wake Jake Morrison, should alert Mr. Garrison to the presence of a stranger on his land, but something held her back. The man was clearly hurt, possibly dying, and by the time she roused the others and they debated what to do, it might be too late. Her mother's voice echoed in her memory. Sometimes the gentlest touch can save a life. She thought of her sewing kit, of the steady hands that had mended countless tears and wounds. Before she could talk herself out of it, she gathered her supplies and slipped out into the night. The wounded man lay crumpled beside the water trough, his breathing shallow and irregular. Up close, she could see that her first assessment had been correct. This shirt was soaked with blood, and there were what looked like bullet holes in the fabric. Someone had used this man for target practice, and somehow he'd managed to stay in the saddle long enough to reach the ranch. She knelt beside him and placed her hand on his chest, feeling for a heartbeat. It was there, weak but steady. He was alive, but just barely. In the moonlight, she could see that he was younger than she'd expected, maybe in his early 30s, with dark hair and the kind of weathered face that spoke of years spent outdoors. His clothes were well-made but practical, and his boots bore the kind of wear that came from long days in the saddle. There was a gun belt around his waist, the holster empty. She looked around and spotted the pistol lying in the dirt where it had fallen. It was a Colt .45, well-maintained and expensive. This was no common drifter. The man stirred, his eyes fluttering open. They were dark, almost black in the moonlight, and they focused on her with surprising clarity. "Please," he whispered, his voice barely audible, "don't let them find me." Callie looked toward the main house, where a single light burned in Mr. Garrison's study. She could wake the household, turn this stranger over to proper authority, and wash her hands of whatever trouble he'd brought to their doorstep. It would be the sensible thing to do, the safe thing. Instead, she made a choice that would change everything. "Can you walk?" she asked quietly. He tried to sit up and gasped in pain. "I don't think so." "Then we're going to have to do this the hard way." She glanced around the yard, grateful for the shadows that concealed them. "There's a barn about 50 yards from here. If I can get you there, I can take a proper look at your wounds." He nodded weakly, and she helped him to his feet. He was heavier than she'd expected, his weight pressing against her as they made their way slowly toward the barn. Every step seemed to cost him, and by the time they reached the shelter of the building, he was barely conscious. The barn was dark and filled with the familiar scents of hay and leather. She helped him to a pile of straw in one of the empty stalls and went to retrieve her sewing kit. When she returned, he was unconscious again, his breathing so shallow she had to put her ear to his chest to make sure he was still alive. By the light of a carefully shielded lantern, she began to assess the damage. There were bullet holes in his shirt, at least half a dozen of them, and when she cut the fabric away, she found wounds that made her stomach clench. Someone had tried very hard to kill this man, and they'd come remarkably close to succeeding. But as she examined each wound more carefully, she realized that most of the bullets were still in him, and that was probably what had saved his life. The wounds had sealed themselves around the metal, preventing him from bleeding to death. Now, if she could remove the bullets and clean the wounds properly, he might have a chance. She had no medical training beyond what her mother had taught her about tending cuts and scrapes, but she understood the basics of keeping a wound clean and allowing the body to heal itself. And she had steady hands, which might be enough. The work was slow and painstaking. One by one, she located the bullets and carefully extracted them, using her smallest needle as a probe and her steadiest grip to pull them free. The man remained unconscious throughout, which was probably a blessing. Each bullet made a small metallic sound as she dropped it into a tin cup, and by the time she was finished, she had removed 11 pieces of lead from his body. 11 bullets. She stared at the cup in amazement. How had he managed to stay on his horse with 11 bullets in him? What kind of man possessed that kind of will to survive? She cleaned each wound as best she could with water from the horse trough and strips of cloth torn from her spare shirt. Then she began the delicate work of stitching the larger wounds closed, using the finest thread in her kit and the techniques her mother had taught her for mending tears that needed to be both strong and nearly invisible. The work took hours. By the time she finished, the sky was beginning to lighten in the east, and she knew the other hands would be stirring soon. She covered the stranger with a horse blanket and gathered up the evidence of her night's work, the bloody cloths, the cup of bullets, the torn shirt. As she prepared to leave, the man's eyes opened again. This time they were clearer, more alert. "Thank you," he whispered. "I owe you my life." "Just rest," she said quietly. "Don't try to move. I'll check on you when I can." He reached into his jacket with obvious difficulty and pulled out a small object, pressing it into her palm. It was a silver coin, heavier than any she'd ever held, with markings she didn't recognize. "Keep this," he said. "It might be important someday." She wanted to ask him who he was, who had shot him, why he'd chosen to seek refuge at the Garrison ranch, but the sound of voices from the direction of the bunkhouse told her that her time was up. She slipped the coin into her pocket and made her way back to her quarters, slipping in just as Jake Morrison emerged from his room. "You're up early," he observed, though his tone suggested curiosity rather than suspicion. "Couldn't sleep," she replied, which was true enough. "Thought I'd get an early start on the day." As she prepared for the morning's work, she could feel the weight of the silver coin in her pocket. She had no idea what she'd gotten herself into, but she knew with absolute certainty that her quiet, invisible life was about to become very complicated indeed. The stranger in the barn was no ordinary drifter, and the men who had shot him were probably still looking for him. By saving his life, she had made herself part of whatever deadly game he was playing. All she could do now was hope that her small act of mercy wouldn't cost them both everything they had left to lose. Dawn broke, with all the urgency of consequences coming home to roost. Thomas Garrison stood in his kitchen, his face carved from granite, as he listened to Jake Morrison's morning report. The foreman had discovered the stranger's horse, still saddled and bearing the unmistakable signs of hard travel and fresh blood on the saddle leather. "You're telling me some wounded man rode onto my property in the middle of the night and not one person saw fit to wake me?" Garrison's voice carried the kind of controlled anger that made smart men step carefully. "We found tracks leading to the barn," Jake said, his hat in his hands. "Whoever it was, they're long gone now. But Tom, that horse is worth more than most men see in a year. This wasn't some common drifter." Garrison's eyes swept the assembled ranch hands, lingering on each face as if he could read guilt in their expressions. When his gaze fell on Callie, she forced herself to meet it steadily, though her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. "Search every building," Garrison ordered. "I want to know what happened here, and I want to know now." The search was thorough and methodical. Callie continued her morning chores, mucking stalls and feeding horses, while the men combed through every inch of the ranch buildings. When they reached the barn where she'd hidden the stranger, she held her breath and waited for the shouts of discovery. They found nothing. The stranger had vanished, as completely as if he'd never existed, leaving behind only the faintest traces of disturbed straw and a few drops of blood that could have come from any injured animal. Callie began to wonder if she'd dreamed the entire encounter, if her lonely mind had conjured a wounded gunslinger out of moonlight and wishful thinking. But the silver coin in her pocket was real enough, heavy and warm against her fingers. She'd examined it by candlelight that morning, studying the strange markings that seemed to shift and change in the flickering flame. It was no ordinary currency, and the man who'd given it to her was no ordinary drifter. The search continued through the morning, expanding beyond the immediate ranch buildings to include the surrounding pastures and outbuildings. Garrison had brought in 2 men from town, hard-eyed individuals who asked pointed questions and seemed more interested in the blood on the horse's saddle than in any missing property. "Callie," the voice behind her made her jump. She turned to find Jake Morrison watching her with troubled eyes. "Mr. Garrison wants to see you in his study." The walk to the ranch house felt like a march to the gallows. Garrison's study was a cramped, book-lined room that smelled of tobacco and leather, dominated by a massive oak desk that had belonged to his father. The rancher sat behind it now, his fingers steepled as he studied her, with the intensity of a man trying to solve a particularly difficult puzzle. "Sit down, Callie." His tone was neutral, giving nothing away. She took the chair across from his desk, keeping her hands folded in her lap to hide their trembling. On the desk between them lay a piece of paper, water-stained and torn, with what looked like part of an illustration still visible on one corner. "You know what this is?" Garrison asked, tapping the paper with one finger. Callie leaned forward slightly, her stomach dropping as she recognized the fragment. It was part of a wanted poster, damaged by blood and weather, but still legible enough to make out the words "Wanted" and "Reward" in bold letters. Below that, she could see part of a crude drawing a man's face in profile, dark hair and strong jaw. "Looks like a wanted poster," she said carefully, "though it's too damaged to make out much." "Found it caught on the fence line near where that horse came through," Garrison said, "along with this." He held up a strip of cloth, dark with dried blood. "Torn from a man's shirt, I'd say. Good quality fabric, not the kind a common outlaw would wear." Callie forced herself to maintain eye contact. "I don't understand what this has to do with me, Mr. Garrison. Maybe nothing. Maybe everything." He leaned back in his chair, studying her with those pale eyes that missed very little. "See, Callie, I've been thinking about last night, about how a wounded man could ride onto my property, lose that much blood, and then disappear without a trace. And I keep coming back to the same question. Who would help a man like that? Who would risk harboring a wanted fugitive?" The weight of the silver coin seemed to burn through the fabric of her pocket. "I don't know what you're suggesting, sir." "I'm not suggesting anything, I'm asking." Garrison's voice hardened. "Did you see anything last night? Hear anything? A wounded man doesn't just vanish into thin air." Callie met his gaze steadily. "I was asleep until dawn, Mr. Garrison. Didn't hear or see anything unusual. For a long moment, the only sound in the room was the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner." Then Garrison sighed and pushed the wanted poster toward her. "Take a good look at that drawing, Callie. Tell me if the face means anything to you." She picked up the fragment, her heart racing as she studied the partial illustration. The artist had been skilled enough to capture something essential about the subject: the strong jaw, the intelligent eyes, the bearing of a man accustomed to command. Even damaged and blood-stained, the resemblance to the stranger she'd helped was unmistakable. "I can't make out enough to tell," she lied. "Could be anyone." Garrison watched her for another long moment, then held out his hand for the paper. "Maybe you're right. Maybe I'm seeing shadows where there aren't any. He folded the poster and slipped it into his desk drawer. But I want you to understand something, Callie. This ranch is all I have left. I won't have it turned into a hideout for outlaws and gunfighters. If I find out someone on my property helped a wanted man escape justice, that someone will be gone by sunset. Am I making myself clear? Yes, sir. Perfectly clear. Good. He stood, effectively dismissing her. Get back to work. And Callie, if you remember anything at all about last night, you come find me immediately. She rose from the chair on unsteady legs. Yes, sir. The walk back to the barn felt endless. Every step took her further from the safety of invisibility and deeper into a web of consequences she couldn't escape. She'd saved a man's life, acted out of simple human compassion, and now she was balanced on the knife's edge of discovery. The other ranch hands watched her with curious eyes as she returned to her work, but none asked questions. In a place like this, a private conversation with the boss usually meant one of two things: promotion or termination. Given her pale complexion and shaking hands, most assumed it wasn't the former. She threw herself into the familiar routine of ranch work, trying to lose herself in the mindless repetition of chores. But her thoughts kept returning to the stranger in the barn, to the careful way he'd spoken despite his pain, to the weight of the silver coin that seemed to grow heavier with each passing hour. The sun was nearing its zenith when she heard the sound of approaching horses. Not the easy gait of ranch horses returning from pasture, but the purposeful rhythm of riders with urgent business. She looked up from the fence she was mending to see a group of men riding hard toward the ranch house, their horses lathered with sweat and their expressions grim. Jake Morrison intercepted them at the main gate, and she could hear voices raised in heated conversation. After a few minutes, Jake rode back toward the ranch house at a gallop, his face grave. Within minutes, Thomas Garrison emerged from the house, still strapping on his gun belt. The riders dismounted, and Callie recognized the man in the lead, Sheriff Porter from town, a fair man but one who took his duty seriously. Behind him were three men she didn't know, all wearing the hard look of professional lawmen, federal marshals perhaps, or territorial agents. The kind of men who pursued the kind of fugitive whose picture appeared on wanted posters. "Gather the hands," she heard Garrison call to Jake. "Everyone in the main yard, now." The assembly was swift and efficient. Within minutes, all 15 ranch hands stood in a rough line facing the visitors. Callie found herself between two of the older hands, grateful for their bulk as she tried to make herself as inconspicuous as possible. Sheriff Porter stepped forward, his badge glinting in the afternoon sun. "Gentlemen, we're looking for a man who passed through this area last night." Wounded man riding a bay gelding, probably bleeding pretty heavily. "Anyone see or hear anything?" The silence stretched on for several heartbeats. Then one of the hands, a young cowboy named Pete, cleared his throat. "Sheriff, we found that bay horse this morning. No rider, though. Just the horse, all lathered up and with blood on the saddle." "Where is it now?" "In the corral behind the barn," Jake answered. "We figured someone would come looking for it." One of the federal agents stepped forward. He was a tall man with cold eyes and the bearing of someone accustomed to getting answers. "The man we're tracking is extremely dangerous. He's wanted for murder, robbery, and conspiracy against the federal government. Anyone harboring him would be considered an accomplice." Callie felt the blood drain from her face. Murder, conspiracy. The gentle-voiced stranger who'd thanked her for saving his life was wanted for crimes that carried the death penalty. "We'll search the premises," the agent continued, "and I want to speak with each of you individually. If this man was here, if any of you saw him or helped him, now is the time to speak up. Cooperation will be noted. Obstruction will not be tolerated." The interviews were conducted in Garrison's study, one by one. Callie waited her turn with growing dread, watching as each hand emerged from the house with expressions ranging from relief to confusion. None seemed to have told the investigators anything useful. When her turn came, she found herself facing the federal agent across Garrison's desk. He'd introduced himself as Marshal Davies, and his pale eyes seemed to see right through her carefully constructed facade of ignorance. "Miss Jenson," he began, consulting a notebook, "you've been working here for 3 years, is that correct?" "Yes, sir." "And you sleep in the bunkhouse?" "Yes, sir." "Did you see or hear anything unusual last night? Any disturbance, any unfamiliar sounds?" She met his gaze as steadily as she could. "No, sir. I sleep pretty soundly." "The man we're tracking is known as Levi Cross. Ever heard that name?" "No, sir." "He's a former member of the Kellerman gang, turned traitor against his own partners, stole a significant amount of their money, and killed 3 men in the process. Ring any bells?" Callie's mouth felt dry as dust. "No, sir. I don't know anything about that." Marshal Davies leaned back in his chair, studying her with those unsettling eyes. "Miss Jenson, I've been tracking fugitives for 15 years. I've developed a sense for when people are telling me the truth. Right now, that sense is telling me you know more than you're saying." "I don't know what you want me to tell you, Marshal. I didn't see anything." "What I want," Davies said softly, "is for you to understand that Levi Cross is not some romantic outlaw from a dime novel. He's a cold-blooded killer who would put a bullet in your head without a second thought if it served his purposes. If he's threatened you, or if you're protecting him out of some misguided sympathy, you're making a mistake that could cost you your life." The weight of the silver coin seemed to pulse against her leg. "I understand, Marshal, but I still don't know anything about this man or where he might be." Davies stared at her for another long moment, then closed his notebook with a snap. "Very well, but Miss Jenson, if your memory improves, you know where to find me. And I should mention there's a substantial reward for information leading to Cross's capture. Enough money to buy a small ranch, start a new life somewhere. Think about that." The dismissal was clear. Callie rose from the chair, her legs unsteady beneath her. As she reached the door, Davies spoke again. "One more thing, Miss Jenson. That's a very fine horse Cross was riding. Thoroughbred stock. Probably worth more than you make in 5 years. Makes a man wonder why he'd abandon an animal like that, unless, of course, he knew he could find another mount somewhere else." She didn't trust herself to speak, simply nodded and left the room. Outside, the late afternoon sun seemed too bright, and she had to steady herself against the porch railing to keep from stumbling. The investigators continued their search through the evening, combing through every building and questioning several of the hands a second time. They found nothing, of course, because there was nothing to find. The stranger, Levi Cross, had vanished as completely as if he'd never existed. As darkness fell, the lawmen finally departed, taking Cross's horse with them as evidence. Callie watched them ride away from her window in the bunkhouse, their torches creating dancing shadows against the night sky. She waited another hour, until the sounds from the other sleeping quarters had settled into the familiar symphony of snores and rustling blankets. Then she slipped out into the darkness, making her way by memory and moonlight to the barn where she'd hidden the wounded fugitive. The building was empty, of course. Whatever traces of his presence might have remained had been trampled away by the searchers. But in the corner of the stall where she'd treated his wounds, something glinted in the pale light filtering through the boards. She knelt and picked up a small object from the Strawa single bullet, one she'd missed during her frantic work the night before. It was a .44 caliber, the kind of heavy slug that would drop a man in his tracks. 11 others like it had been buried in Levi Cross's flesh, and somehow he'd survived them all. As she stared at the bullet in her palm, footsteps sounded behind her. She spun around, her heart leaping into her throat, to find Thomas Garrison standing in the barn doorway. In the moonlight, his face was a mask of grim determination. "Find what you were looking for, Callie?" The bullet seemed to burn in her palm. There was no point in lying now, no way to explain away her presence in the barn or the evidence in her hand. "Mr. Garrison, I can explain." "No need for explanations." His voice was quiet, final. "Pack your things. I want you off my property before sunrise." The words hit her like a physical blow. "Sir, please. I've worked here for 3 years. I've never caused trouble, never." "You harbored a wanted fugitive, a killer." Garrison's tone brooked no argument. I told you what would happen if I found out someone had helped him. I meant what I said. Where am I supposed to go? I don't have any money, any family. That's not my concern. He turned to leave, then paused. You're lucky Marshal Davies didn't find that bullet. Obstruction of justice is a federal crime. You could be looking at prison time. After he left, Callie sank to her knees in the straw, the bullet still clutched in her fist. In the space of 24 hours, her entire world had collapsed. She was homeless, jobless, and marked as an outlaw's accomplice. The man she'd saved out of simple human compassion had destroyed everything she'd worked to build. But as she knelt there in the darkness, surrounded by the familiar scents of hay and horses, she found herself thinking not of her ruined life, but of the stranger's eyes, dark and intelligent, holding depths of pain that had nothing to do with his wounds. Whatever crimes Levi Cross had committed, whatever violence had brought him to her doorstep riddled with bullets, there had been something in those eyes that spoke of honor rather than evil. She closed her fist around the bullet and made a choice that would define everything that followed. She would not regret saving his life. Whatever consequences awaited her, whatever price she would pay for her moment of mercy, she would face them with the knowledge that she had acted according to her conscience rather than her fears. The silver coin in her pocket seemed to pulse with warmth, as if responding to her resolution. Somewhere out there in the vast darkness of the frontier, Levi Cross was alive because of her actions. She could only hope that when their paths crossed again and somehow she knew he would prove worthy of the sacrifice she'd made. The town of Socorro huddled against the desert, like a collection of sun-bleached bones, its adobe buildings cracked and weathered by the relentless New Mexico sun. Callie rode into its dusty streets, just as the morning light turned the eastern mountains, the color of old blood, her few possessions rolled in a blanket behind her saddle. Dusty had been the one kindness Thomas Garrison had shown, allowing her to keep the old mare rather than leaving her afoot in the wilderness. Consider it severance pay, he'd said, though they both knew the horse was worth more than the wages he owed her. The main street stretched before her like a gauntlet of suspicious stares and whispered conversations. News traveled fast in a small frontier town, and by now everyone would know about the federal marshal's visit to the Garrison ranch. Her association with whatever had brought them would make finding work difficult, if not impossible. She guided Dusty to the hitching post outside Miller's general store, where a hand-lettered sign in the window advertised for a shop clerk. It was a long-shot, respectable business owners, rarely hired women without references or local connections, but she had to start somewhere. Inside, the store smelled of leather and lamp oil, with shelves lined with everything from buttons to bullets. Abel Miller stood behind the counter, a thin man with nervous eyes who looked up from his ledger with the expression of someone expecting trouble. "Help you, miss? I saw your sign about needing a clerk. I'd like to apply for the position." Miller's eyes narrowed slightly. "You wouldn't be that woman from the Garrison place, would you? The one mixed up in all that business with the marshals?" "I worked for Mr. Garrison, yes, but I wasn't mixed up in anything." "That's not what I heard." Miller shook his head. "Sorry, miss, but I can't afford to have federal agents sniffing around my business. Bad for trade, you understand." It was the same story at the next 3 establishments she tried. The blacksmith needed help with his books, but he'd already heard about her involvement with wanted fugitives. The hotel proprietor wouldn't even let her finish her request before showing her the door. By midday, she was beginning to understand the true cost of her mercy. She found herself at the Red River Saloon, not as a patron, but because desperate circumstances sometimes required desperate measures. The establishment was the kind of place where questions weren't asked and backgrounds weren't checked, so long as a person could work hard and keep their mouth shut. The saloon's interior was thick with tobacco smoke and the sour smell of spilled whiskey. A few early drinkers hunched over their glasses at scattered tables, while a piano player in a threadbare vest picked out a melancholy tune in the corner. Behind the bar, a large woman with graying hair and shrewd eyes surveyed her domain like a general commanding troops. "You lost, honey?" the woman asked as Callie approached the bar. "Looking for work, actually. I heard you might need help." The woman who introduced herself as Big Martha looked Callie up and down, with eyes that had seen everything the frontier had to offer. "You're that girl from the Garrison place, the one who's supposed to have helped some outlaw." "I didn't help anyone. I just got caught up in circumstances beyond my control." "Circumstances?" Big Martha laughed, but not unkindly. "Hell, honey, circumstances have been catching up with women like us since Eve took that bite of apple. Question is, what kind of work you looking for? I run a respectable establishment here, but I got to tell you, a woman on her own don't have many choices in a town like this." Callie understood the subtext. Women without family or means often found themselves with limited options, most of them involving compromise of one kind or another. "I can read and write. I'm good with numbers. I can cook and clean and sew. Can you handle drunks without getting yourself hurt? Can you keep your ears open and your mouth shut? Can you work nights and sleep days and not ask too many questions about what goes on after midnight?" "I can do whatever needs doing, as long as it's honest work." Big Martha studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Tell you what, I need someone to help with the books, keep track of inventory, maybe serve drinks when things get busy. Pay's not much, but it includes a room upstairs and 3 meals a day. Interested?" It wasn't what Callie had hoped for, but it was better than sleeping under the stars. "Yes, ma'am. I'm interested." "Good, but understand something right now. I don't care what you did or didn't do out at that ranch. What I care about is loyalty. You work for me, you keep my secrets, and I'll keep yours. But if you bring trouble to my door, if federal agents come sniffing around because of something you've done, I'll put you out so fast your head will spin. We clear?" Crystal clear. The room Big Martha showed her was small but clean, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a window that looked out over the main street. It was a far cry from the bunkhouse at the Garrison ranch, but it was hers, and after the events of the past 24 hours, having any kind of shelter felt like a blessing. As she unpacked her few belongings, Callie found herself thinking about the man who'd caused her current circumstances. Levi Crosskiller, traitor, conspirator against the federal government. At least, that's what Marshal Davies had called him. But the man she'd treated in the barn had spoken with courtesy and gratitude, not the cold calculation she'd expect from a hardened criminal. She pulled the silver coin from her pocket and examined it in the afternoon light streaming through her window. The markings were definitely not standard currency intricate symbols that seemed to shift and change depending on the angle of the light. On one side was what looked like an eagle with its wings spread, but the craftsmanship was finer than anything she'd seen on territorial or federal coins. On the other side were words in what might have been Latin, surrounding a design that could have been a government seal. Hidden beneath her spare clothes, wrapped in an old shirt, was the bullet she'd found in the barn. She'd kept it without really understanding why, perhaps as evidence of the night that had changed everything. Now, looking at it alongside the mysterious coin, she began to wonder if there was more to Levi Cross's story than what the federal marshals had revealed. A soft knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. She quickly hid the coin and bullet, then opened the door to find a young woman about her own age standing in the hallway. She was pretty in a tired way, with blonde hair and blue eyes that held the kind of weariness that came from seeing too much of life's harsh realities. "I'm Rose," the woman said. "Martha sent me up to see if you need anything. I work downstairs mostly, but I help the new girls get settled." "Thank you. I'm Callie, and I'm not sure what kind of work I'll be doing downstairs." Rose smiled, and for a moment the weariness left her eyes. "Martha's good about matching people to what they can handle. You've got the look of someone who's book-learned, so you'll probably spend most of your time with the ledgers and inventory. The rest of us will handle the more social aspects of the business." Callie understood. The Red River Saloon was like most frontier establishments of its kind, part tavern, part hotel, part entertainment venue. The women who worked there provided companionship to lonely men in various forms, from simple conversation to more intimate services. It was a life that many women fell into when other options were exhausted. "How long have you been here?" Callie asked. 3 years. Came here after my husband died in a mining accident up north. Didn't have anywhere else to go. Rose shrugged. It's not the life I planned, but Martha treats us fair, and the money's better than most women can make on their own. That evening, Callie began her new life as the Red River's bookkeeper and occasional serving girl. The work was straightforward, tracking inventory, recording sales, managing the accounts that local businesses kept with the saloon. Big Martha had been right about her need for someone with education. The previous books were a mess of scrawled notes and questionable arithmetic. As the night wore on and the saloon filled with its usual clientele, Callie found herself observing the intricate social dynamics of frontier nightlife. Cowboys from the surrounding ranches mingled with traveling salesmen, local business owners, and the occasional drifter passing through town. The women moved among them with practiced ease, knowing exactly how to read each man's needs and desires. It was near midnight when she first noticed the stranger. He sat alone at a corner table, nursing a glass of whiskey and watching the room with eyes that missed nothing. There was something familiar about the way he held himself, straight-backed and alert, like a man accustomed to command. In the flickering lamplight, she couldn't make out his features clearly, but something about him set her nerves on edge. "You see him too," Rose murmured, appearing at Callie's elbow with a tray of empty glasses. "See who?" "Corner table. The one who's been watching you since you came downstairs." Rose's voice carried a note of concern. "He's been asking questions, quiet-like, but persistent. Wants to know about new faces in town, particularly women who might have arrived in the last day or two." Callie's blood ran cold. "What kind of questions?" "The kind that make Martha nervous, the kind that usually mean trouble." Rose set down her tray and touched Callie's arm. "Honey, I don't know what you're running from, but that man's got the look of someone who's paid to find people who don't want to be found." Through the smoky haze of the saloon, Callie caught another glimpse of the stranger. This time, the light caught his face more clearly, and she saw the cold, calculating eyes of Marshal Davies. He'd followed her to Socorro, was watching her, waiting for her to make contact with Levi Cross or do something else that would confirm his suspicions about her involvement with the fugitive. "I need to get out of here," she whispered to Rose. "Backstairs," Rose replied without hesitation. "Through the kitchen, out the alley door. But Callie, if you're in the kind of trouble I think you're in, running won't solve it. Men like that don't give up easy." Callie made her way through the crowded saloon, trying to appear casual as she headed toward the kitchen. Behind the bar, Big Martha caught her eye and nodded slightly, a signal that she understood what was happening and approved of Callie's decision to leave. The alley behind the Red River was dark and narrow, filled with the refuse of daily commerce. Callie pressed herself against the wall and tried to think. Davies had found her within hours of her arrival in Socorro. If she ran again, he'd simply follow her to the next town, and the next, until she either led him to Levi Cross or exhausted her ability to keep moving. The sound of footsteps echoed from the mouth of the alley. Slow, deliberate, unhurried. Davies wasn't running after her. He was confident that she had nowhere to go. In a town like Socorro, there were only so many places a woman alone could hide. "Miss Jenson." His voice carried clearly in the still air. He'd followed her into the alley, was standing between her and the only exit. In the darkness, she could just make out his silhouette, purposeful, implacable. "Marshal," she replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "Running away from something?" "Just getting some air. It was stuffy inside." "I'm sure it was." Davies stepped closer, and she could see his face in the dim light spilling from the saloon's windows. "Tell me, Miss Jenson, what brings a woman of your background to a place like the Red River? Hardly seems like suitable employment for someone who was working an honest ranch just yesterday." "I needed work. They offered it." "Yes, I'm sure they did. Big Martha's always been generous with women who find themselves in difficult circumstances." His tone carried an undertone of threat that made her skin crawl. "Of course, working in a place like this exposes a person to all sorts of unsavory characters. Drifters, outlaws, men running from the law. The kind of men who might seek shelter with someone they considered sympathetic to their cause." Callie understood what he was implying. By taking a job at the Red River, she'd placed herself in exactly the kind of environment where a fugitive might make contact. Davies thought she was positioning herself to help Levi Cross, or at least to receive communication from him. "I don't know anything about fugitives or outlaws, Marshal. I'm just trying to make a living." "Of course you are." Davies reached into his coat and pulled out a folded paper. Even in the dim light, she could see it was another wanted poster, this one, newer and less damaged than the fragment Garrison had shown her. "Take a look at this, Miss Jenson. Tell me if the face looks familiar." She accepted the poster, with hands she hoped weren't shaking too visibly. In the pale light, she could see a detailed illustration of a man's face-strong features, intelligent eyes, the bearing of someone accustomed to authority. It was definitely the stranger she'd treated, captured with an artist's skill that left no room for doubt. "Levi Cross," Davies said softly, "also known as the Phantom, former outlaw, current federal fugitive, wanted for murder, conspiracy, and treason against the United States government. Reward of $5,000 for his capture, dead or alive." $5,000. It was more money than most people in Socorro would see in a lifetime. Enough to buy a ranch, start a new life, escape the kind of desperate circumstances that had driven her to seek work in a frontier saloon. "I've never seen this man," she lied. "Haven't you?" Davies moved closer, close enough that she could smell the tobacco on his breath. "Because I have it on good authority that someone matching your description was seen tending to wounded stranger on the night in question. Someone with medical skills, someone capable of removing bullets and treating serious injuries." "You have the wrong person, Marshal." "Do I?" He reached out and touched the sleeve of her dress, where a small stain remained, despite her efforts to wash it clean. "That looks like blood to me, Miss Jenson. Old blood, the kind that comes from close contact with serious wounds." Callie jerked her arm away. "I work with animals. Blood is part of ranch life." "Yes, I'm sure it is." Davies stepped back, but his eyes never left her face. "Let me make you an offer, Miss Jenson. Help me find Levi Cross, and I'll see that you receive a portion of that reward money. Refuse, and I'll have you arrested as an accessory to murder and conspiracy. Your choice." The silence stretched between them like a taut wire. In the distance, she could hear the sounds of the saloon laughter, piano music, the clink of glasses. Normal life continuing while her world balanced on the edge of a precipice. "I can't help you find someone I've never met," she said finally. "Then we have a problem." Davies folded the wanted poster and slipped it back into his coat. "Because I know you're lying, Miss Jenson. I can see it in your eyes, hear it in your voice. And I'm going to keep watching you until you either lead me to Cross or I find enough evidence to put you in federal prison." He turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing off the alley walls until they faded into the general noise of the town. Callie remained pressed against the wall for several minutes after he'd gone, her heart pounding and her mind racing with the implications of the encounter. Davies wasn't going to give up. He was convinced she could lead him to Levi Cross, and he was prepared to destroy her life to make that happen. But what troubled her most was the description he'd used, the Phantom, wanted for treason against the United States government. That suggested something far more complex than a simple outlaw story. As she made her way back into the saloon through the kitchen entrance, she found Big Martha waiting for her with a cup of coffee and a concerned expression. "Federal Marshal?" Martha asked without preamble. "Yes, he thinks I can help him find someone." "Can you?" Callie met the older woman's eyes. "I don't know where this person is. I couldn't help him even if I wanted to. But you know who he's looking for." It wasn't a question, and Callie saw no point in lying to someone who was offering her shelter. "I may have encountered this person once. Briefly, I gave him some medical attention." Big Martha nodded slowly. "And now you're paying the price for being a good Samaritan." She sipped her coffee thoughtfully. "Let me tell you something, honey. In my experience, federal marshals don't chase people with that kind of intensity unless there's more to the story than what's written on the wanted posters. Sometimes the line between hero and villain ain't as clear as the law likes to pretend." "What are you saying?" I'm saying maybe you should ask yourself why a man would risk everything to ride wounded through hostile territory, instead of seeking help from official sources. And maybe you should consider that the people hunting him might not be the heroes they claim to be. The words stayed with Callie long after she'd returned to her small room above the saloon. As she lay in the narrow bed, listening to the sounds of Socorro settling into sleep, she turned the silver coin over and over in her fingers. Whatever Levi Cross had done, whatever crimes he'd committed, there was something about his situation that didn't align with the story Marshal Davies was telling. Outside her window, she could see a lone figure standing across the street, partially concealed in the shadows between two buildings. Davies had made good on his promise to watch her. She was trapped in Socorro, as surely as if she were in a jail cell, waiting for a contact that might never come, from a man who had disappeared into the vast wilderness of the frontier. But as she finally drifted off to sleep, her hand closed around the warm metal of the silver coin, she found herself hoping that somewhere out there, Levi Cross was alive and free. Whatever the cost to herself, she had acted according to her conscience, and she would face the consequences with the same quiet dignity her mother had taught her. The game of cat and mouse had begun in earnest, and Callie Jenson was about to discover that sometimes the only way out of a trap was to become the hunter instead of the prey. 3 days passed, with the rhythm of careful observation and growing tension. Marshal Davies made no effort to conceal his surveillance, taking his meals at the hotel restaurant directly across from the Red River and positioning himself where he could monitor every person who entered or left the saloon. His presence was like a storm cloud on the horizon, ominous, persistent, and impossible to ignore. Callie maintained the pretense of normal life, working with Big Martha's ledgers during the day and occasionally helping serve drinks in the evening hours. But every moment was shadowed by the awareness that Davies was watching, waiting for her to make contact with Levi Cross, or do something that would confirm his suspicions about her involvement with the fugitive. On the 4th morning, as she was reconciling the previous week's receipts, Big Martha approached with a troubled expression and a bundle of letters in her hand. "These came in on yesterday's stage," Martha said, setting the correspondence on the desk where Callie worked. "Most of it's the usual business invoices, orders for supplies, but there's one that's addressed to you." Callie looked up in surprise. "To me? But nobody knows I'm here." "That's what worries me." Martha pulled a single envelope from the bundle. It was expensive paper, cream-colored and heavy, with Callie's name written in an elegant hand. There was no return address, and the postmark was too smudged to read clearly. With trembling fingers, Callie opened the envelope and extracted a single sheet of matching paper. The message was brief and written in the same careful script. "Miss Jenson, your kindness has not been forgotten. If you are willing to complete the good work you began, there is a small church 5 miles north of town on the old mining road. Sunday service begins at 10 o'clock. All souls are welcome, regardless of their past. A friend." There was no signature, but beneath the message was a small drawing-gan eagle with outstretched wings, identical to the design on the silver coin that still rested in her pocket. "Bad news?" Martha asked, noting Callie's pale complexion. "I'm not sure." Callie folded the letter carefully. "Someone wants to meet me at a church outside town. Someone you know. Someone I helped once. Someone who might be in trouble." Big Martha's expression grew serious. "Honey, you need to think real careful about this. That federal marshal ain't going to give up watching you, and if you lead him to whoever you're protecting, you'll both end up in chains." Callie understood the warning, but she also understood something else. The letter represented more than just a request for another mitingit, was an opportunity to learn the truth about Levi Cross and the circumstances that had brought him to her barn, riddled with bullets. The questions that had plagued her for days might finally find answers. "How would I get there without being followed?" she asked. Martha smiled grimly. "Leave that to me. I've been helping people disappear and reappear in this territory longer than that marshal's been wearing a badge." That afternoon, Rose approached Callie with a proposition that seemed innocent on the surface, but carried layers of meaning that only someone familiar with frontier survival would understand. "Some of us girls are planning a picnic tomorrow," Rose said loudly enough for the other patrons to hear. "Up at Miller's Creek, where it's cool and peaceful. You should come along, you've been working too hard lately." The plan was simple but effective. The women would leave together in a wagon, ostensibly for an afternoon of leisure by the creek. Davies would follow, of course, but at a discreet distance that would allow the group to implement their real strategy. While he watched the main party, Callie would slip away on horseback, taking a circuitous route to the church, while the others provided distraction and misdirection. Sunday morning dawned clear and bright, with the kind of crystalline air that made distant mountains seem close enough to touch. The wagon departed the Red River at 9 o'clock, loaded with picnic supplies and chattering women who seemed genuinely excited about their outing. Callie sat among them, trying to project the same carefree mood, while her stomach churned with nervous anticipation. As expected, Davies appeared on horseback about a quarter-mile behind them, maintaining visual contact while trying to appear casual. He was a skilled tracker, but he was also operating under assumptions about female behavior that Martha and her girls were prepared to exploit. The creek lay 3 miles north of town, accessible by a winding road that passed through several groves of cottonwood trees. It was in the second grove that the plan went into action. While the wagon continued toward the creek at its usual pace, Callie slipped from the back and made her way to where Dusty waited, hidden among the trees, already saddled and ready for a hard ride. The old mining road was little more than a dirt track that wandered through broken country toward the foothills of the mountains. Callie pushed Dusty as hard as she dared, knowing that her window of opportunity would be narrow. Once Davies realized she wasn't with the picnic party, he would backtrack and try to pick up her trail. The church, when she finally reached it, was a modest, adobe structure that had clearly seen better days. Its bell tower leaned slightly to one side, and several of the wooden crosses that topped the building had fallen into disrepair. But there were signs of recent use: fresh flowers by the door, swept steps, and the faint sound of voices from within. Callie dismounted and tied Dusty to a hitching post that looked like it might collapse under the mare's weight. As she approached the church, she could hear the low murmur of a service in progress. Through the open doorway, she could see perhaps a dozen people seated on rough wooden benches, their attention focused on a figure at the simple altar. She slipped inside as quietly as possible, taking a seat in the back row where she could observe without drawing attention. The congregation was an eclectic mix: a few Mexican families from the local settlements, several obvious miners still wearing their work clothes, and a handful of individuals who had the weathered look of people living on the margins of society. The man conducting the service stood with his back to the congregation, reading from a worn Bible in accented English. There was something familiar about his voice, something that made her pulse quicken with recognition. When he finally turned to face the assembled worshippers, she felt her breath catch in her throat. It was Levi Cross, but transformed in ways that went beyond the obvious changes to his appearance. Gone was the bloodied, desperate fugitive she'd treated in the barn. In his place stood a man who radiated quiet authority and unmistakable charisma. His dark hair was neatly trimmed, his clothes clean and well-fitted. Most striking of all were his eyes, still intelligent and penetrating, but holding a depth of purpose that spoke of a man who had found his calling. He was no longer wearing the badge she'd glimpsed hidden in his coat that night at the ranch, but there was something about his bearing that suggested official authority of some kind. This was not the cold-blooded killer Marshal Davies had described, but neither was he the simple outlaw she'd initially assumed him to be. As the service concluded, the congregation began to disperse, filing out of the church with the quiet satisfaction of people who had found something meaningful in the simple ceremony. Callie remained in her seat, uncertain how to approach a man who seemed so different from the wounded stranger she remembered. "Miss Jenson," his voice carried clearly across the empty church, "thank you for coming." She rose and walked toward the altar, her footsteps echoing in the silence. Up close, She could see the faint scars where her stitches had been, thin white lines that spoke of healing and survival. "You clean up well for a wanted fugitive," she said, trying to keep her tone light despite the tension that filled the space between them. "Is that what they told you I was?" Cross smiled, but there was sadness in his expression. "I suppose from their perspective, that's accurate enough. Marshal Davies showed me your wanted poster. Murder, conspiracy, treason against the United States government. Those are serious charges." "Yes, they are." Cross moved to one of the front pews and gestured for her to sit beside him. "And every one of them is true, in a manner of speaking. The question is whether the law and justice are always the same thing." Callie studied his face, looking for signs of deception or manipulation. Instead, she saw only the kind of weariness that came from carrying heavy burdens for too long. "I think you'd better start at the beginning." "The beginning." Cross was quiet for a moment, as if deciding how much to reveal. "The beginning was 3 years ago, when the War Department asked me to infiltrate the Kellerman gang. They were more than simple outlaws. They were part of a larger conspiracy involving stolen government funds and weapons sales to hostile tribes. My job was to gather evidence and identify their contacts within the territorial government. You were working undercover. For 2.5 years, I became one of them, participated in their crimes, earned their trust. And when I finally had enough evidence to bring down the entire network, I discovered that some of the most trusted names in territorial law enforcement were part of the conspiracy. The implications began to dawn on her, including Marshal Davies. Davies is one of the key figures. He's been using his position to protect the gang's operations and eliminate anyone who threatens to expose them. When I tried to report my findings through official channels, I learned that the corruption reached all the way to the territorial capital. Callie felt a chill run down her spine. "So you stole their money and ran." "I took evidence of their crimes and made them think I was just another greedy outlaw who'd betrayed his partners for personal gain. It was the only way to stay alive long enough to find someone in the federal government who wasn't compromised." "And the murders?" Cross's expression darkened. 3 members of the gang tried to stop me from leaving. I killed them in self-defense, but Davies has spun the story to make me look like the villain. According to his version, I'm a rogue agent who went bad and killed his own partners for money. The pieces were beginning to fit together, but Callie still had questions that demanded answers. "If you're telling the truth, why haven't you contacted Washington directly? Surely someone in the federal government would listen to your evidence." "I tried. The telegraph lines are monitored, and Davies has people watching every stage depot and railroad station within 200 miles. He's been very effective at cutting off my lines of communication." Cross reached into his coat and withdrew a thick bundle of papers. "These are copies of the evidence I gathered, correspondence between gang members and territorial officials, records of stolen government property, maps of arms, caches, financial records showing payoffs to judges and lawmen." Callie examined the papers with growing amazement. The documents were detailed and damning, implicating dozens of people in a conspiracy that reached far beyond simple robbery and murder. If they were genuine, they represented proof of corruption on a scale that would shock the territorial government to its foundations. "This is incredible," she murmured, "but why are you showing them to me? I'm nobody important. Just a ranch hand who happened to be in the wrong place at the right time. Because you saved my life when you had every reason to turn me away. Because you've already paid a price for helping me, and you deserve to know the truth." Cross took the papers back and returned them to his coat. "And because I need your help to get these documents to someone who can act on them." "What kind of help?" "Davies is watching you, waiting for you to lead him to me. But he's also underestimated you. He sees a frightened woman who got in over her head, not someone capable of outthinking him." Cross met her eyes with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. "I need someone who can move freely, someone he won't suspect of carrying important information, someone brave enough to take a risk for the sake of justice." The request hung in the air between them like a challenge. Callie understood what he was asking, to become an active participant in a dangerous game that could cost her everything she had left. But she also understood something else. The man sitting beside her was not the cold-blooded killer Davies had described, but neither was he an innocent victim. He was something more complex, a man who had made difficult choices in service of a cause larger than himself. "Where would I take the documents?" she asked. "There's a federal judge in Denver, Judge Morrison, who's been asking questions about irregularities in territorial law enforcement. He's one of the few people in a position to act on this evidence who isn't compromised by the conspiracy. Denver's 300 miles from here." "I know, and Davies will follow you every step of the way, waiting for you to lead him to me. But if you can get those documents to Judge Morrison, we can end this. The corruption will be exposed, the real criminals will be arrested, and the territory will finally have honest law enforcement." Callie thought about the life she'd built and lost, about the choices that had led her to this moment in a run-down church with a man who carried secrets that could reshape the entire territory. She thought about her mother's words, about gentle hands saving lives, and about the silver coin that had been her only payment for an act of mercy that had changed everything. "If I do this," she said slowly, "what happens to you? I'll continue to draw Davies's attention, make him think I'm still operating in this area. With luck, he'll be so focused on tracking me that he won't realize you're carrying the real prize." Cross smiled, and for the first time since she'd known him, the expression reached his eyes. "Don't worry about me, Miss Jenson. I've been staying one step ahead of them for months now. I can manage a few more weeks." Outside the church, she could hear the sound of approaching horses. Cross heard it too, his body tensing as he moved to peer through one of the small windows. "Davies," he said quietly, "somehow he tracked you here." Callie's heart hammered against her ribs. The picnic, something went wrong with the plan. "There's a back way out through the vestry. Take it now, before he surrounds the building." Cross pressed the bundle of documents into her hands. "These papers are more important than either of our lives. Get them to Denver, to Judge Morrison. Promise me." "I promise." "Good." Cross drew his pistol and checked the cylinder. "Now go, and Callie, whatever happens, don't look back." She clutched the documents to her chest and made her way quickly to the rear of the church. Behind her, she could hear Cross moving toward the front door, preparing to face whatever consequences awaited him. The sound of multiple horses grew louder, accompanied by voices shouting commands. The vestry door opened onto a narrow canyon that wound toward the mountains. Callie ran toward where she'd left Dusty, the precious documents tucked inside her shirt. Behind her, the first gunshots echoed across the broken landscape, sharp reports that spoke of violence and desperation. She mounted Dusty and rode hard toward the canyon walls, not daring to look back toward the church where a good man was making a stand against impossible odds. The documents pressed against her ribs with every jarring step, a constant reminder of the trust that had been placed in her and the justice that now depended on her courage. The game had changed. She was no longer simply a woman caught up in events beyond her control. She was now a key player in a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of territorial government, carrying evidence that could expose corruption and bring justice to those who had abused their power. 300 miles to Denver. 300 miles with Marshal Davies and his men in pursuit through country where an honest lawman was indistinguishable from a corrupt one, where the line between justice and revenge had been blurred beyond recognition. But as she urged Dusty toward the distant mountains, Callie Jenson felt something she hadn't experienced since the night she'd saved Levi Cross's life, a sense of purpose that transcended her own survival. A cause worth the risks she was about to take. The forged letters hidden among her possessions back at the Red River had been Davies's insurance policy, false evidence that would have implicated her as an accomplice if she'd refused to cooperate. Now they seemed like artifacts from another life, symbols of a game she'd finally learned how to play. The stolen ledger felt like it weighed more than the rest of her possessions combined, as Callie made her way through the broken country north of Socorro. 3 days had passed since the confrontation at the church, and she still didn't know if Levi Cross had escaped Davies's trap or paid the ultimate price for trusting her with his evidence. She'd taken a circuitous route toward Denver, avoiding the main roads and staying away from established settlements where Davies might have allies watching for her. The documents hidden in her saddlebags contained more than just correspondence, and financial records stuck among them was a detailed ledger that recorded every transaction, every payoff, every piece of stolen government property that had passed through the conspiracy's hands over the past 3 years. It was this ledger that would prove most damning to the corrupt officials, because it didn't just document their criminality, revealed the scope and organization of an operation that had systematically looted the territorial government while using their positions to protect themselves from investigation. The country she traveled through was harsh and unforgiving, a landscape of broken mesas and hidden canyons where a person could disappear for weeks without encountering another soul. It was also perfect terrain for an ambush, and she found herself checking the horizon constantly for signs of pursuit. On the 4th day, she encountered her first real test. The trading post at Willow Creek was little more than a collection of adobe buildings clustered around a natural spring, but it represented the last reliable source of supplies before the long stretch of wilderness that lay between her and the Colorado border. She needed food for herself and grain for Dusty, but approaching any established settlement meant risk. She observed the post from a ridge, overlooking the valley, studying the layout and watching for signs of unusual activity. What she saw made her blood run cold. There were too many horses tied outside the main building, and several of the men lounging in the shade had the look of professional gunmen rather than ordinary travelers. Through her father's old field glassazone of the few possessions she'd managed to keep from her former life, she could make out a familiar figure standing near the corral. Marshal Davies himself, positioned where he could observe anyone approaching from the south. They'd anticipated her route, or at least guessed correctly that she would need to resupply somewhere along the way. Davies had positioned his men at key points along the possible paths to Denver, turning her escape route into a series of increasingly dangerous obstacles. As she watched, another group of riders approached the trading post from the east. Even at this distance, she could see that they rode with the casual confidence of men accustomed to taking what they wanted. These weren't lawmen, they had the look of the very outlaws Davies was supposedly pursuing. The realization hit her like a physical blow. Davies wasn't just corrupt, was actively working with the criminal elements he was paid to pursue. The men below weren't his deputies or territorial agents. They were members of the Kellerman gang, the same organization Levi Cross had infiltrated and exposed. She was trapped between two groups that wanted her dead or captured, in country that offered little shelter and no allies. Returning to Socorro was impossible. Davies would have left men there to watch for her return. Continuing toward Denver meant running a gauntlet of hostile forces that knew the territory better than she did. But as she studied the terrain around the trading post, she began to see possibilities that a more direct approach would have missed. The spring that fed Willow Creek emerged from a series of limestone caves that honeycombed the eastern wall of the valley. If she could reach those caves unseen, she might be able to move through the underground passages and emerge somewhere beyond the ambush. The approach would have to wait for darkness. She spent the remaining daylight hours hidden in a cluster of boulders, watching the movements below and trying to memorize the layout of the land around the spring. As the sun set, she saw Davies's men settle into positions that would allow them to monitor the main approaches to the trading post throughout the night. What they hadn't anticipated was an approach from above and behind, through country that seemed impossible to traverse on horseback. But Callie had grown up in harsh terrain, and she understood that sometimes the most difficult path was also the safest. She left Dusty hidden among the rocks and made her way down the cliff face on foot, using handholds that were barely visible in the moonlight. The stolen ledger and other documents were wrapped in oiled cloth and strapped to her back, protected against both weather and the possibility of a fall that would leave them scattered across the rocky slopes. The cave entrance was narrow and partially concealed by vegetation that had grown up around the spring's outlet. She squeezed through the opening and found herself in a limestone passage that stretched into darkness beyond the reach of starlight. The sound of water echoed from somewhere ahead, suggesting that the underground stream continued deeper into the cave system. Moving through the caves without light was treacherous, but any flame would be visible to the men watching outside. She felt her way forward, inch by inch, following the sound of water and hoping that the passage would eventually lead to another opening on the far side of the valley. The caves proved to be more extensive than she'd anticipated. Branching passages led off in multiple directions, and more than once she found herself in chambers so large that her footsteps echoed like whispers in a cathedral. The underground stream provided a reliable guide, but it also meant that her progress was slow and uncertain. It was nearly dawn when she finally emerged from a concealed opening on the north side of the valley, more than a mile from the trading post and well beyond the perimeter Davies had established. The experience had cost her most of the night, but it had also taught her something important about the resources available to someone willing to think beyond conventional tactics. From her new position, she could see the trading post spread out below like a map. Davies's men were still in position, watching the approaches they expected her to use. But their attention was focused outward, toward the routes a normal traveler would take. None of them were watching for someone who might emerge from the supposedly impassable country to their rear. She made her way back to where she'd left Dusty, moving carefully through terrain that seemed designed to break a horse's legs. The old mare whickered softly when she appeared, as if to express relief that her human hadn't disappeared permanently into the limestone caves. "We're going to have to get creative, girl," Callie murmured, stroking the mare's neck. "These people know all the normal tricks." The route she chose took them through country that most riders would have considered impassable narrow canyons where the walls closed in overhead, rocky slopes where every step had to be carefully placed, game trails that wandered seemingly at random through broken terrain. It was slow going, but it kept them well away from the main travel routes where Davies's men would be watching. By midday, they had covered perhaps 10 miles in a straight line, though the actual distance traveled was closer to 20. The effort had been exhausting for both horse and rider, but it had also demonstrated something important, that unconventional thinking could overcome superior numbers and resources. As they rested in the shade of an overhanging cliff, Callie pulled out the stolen ledger and studied its contents more carefully. The detail was extraordinary, not just names and amounts, but dates, locations, and methods of operation that revealed the conspiracy's organizational structure. According to the records, the operation had begun small, with a few corrupt officials skimming money from government contracts and supply purchases. But success had bred ambition, and within 2 years they were systematically looting everything from military payrolls to territorial tax collections. The money was being funneled through a complex network of banks and businesses, much of it ending up in accounts controlled by territorial officials who were supposed to be enforcing the law. But what made the ledger truly damning was its revelation of the scope of violence the conspiracy was willing to use to protect itself. There were records of payments to assassins, detailed plans for eliminating witnesses, and correspondence that made it clear Davies and his associates considered murder simply another business expense. One entry in particular caught her attention: a payment of $500 to eliminate the federal agent investigating territorial irregularities. The date was 3 weeks ago, and the note suggested the job had been completed successfully. Levi Cross hadn't been the only federal agent investigating the conspiracy. Someone else had been asking the right questions, and they'd been killed for it. The implications were staggering. Davies wasn't just protecting outlaws, he was actively murdering federal agents to keep his operation secret. The sound of approaching horses interrupted her thoughts. She quickly returned the ledger to her saddlebags and moved to a position where she could observe the valley below without being seen. 3 riders were making their way along a game trail about half a mile to the south, moving with the purposeful gait of men following a specific route. Through her field glasses, she could see that they weren't Davies's Mentha clothes, and equipment marked them as members of the Kellerman gang. But they were clearly searching for something or someone, and their path would bring them uncomfortably close to her position within the hour. She had two choices: continue hiding and hope they passed without detecting her trail, or take more direct action to ensure they couldn't report her location to their associates. The conservative approach was safer in the short term, but it also meant accepting that the net around her was tightening with every passing hour. The decision was made for her when one of the riders dismounted and began examining the ground near where she'd watered Dusty earlier that morning. Even from a distance, she could see him pointing out signs to his companion hoofprints that couldn't be explained by wildlife, disturbed vegetation that suggested the passage of a horse and rider. They'd found her trail, and within minutes they would be following it directly toward her hiding place. Callie checked her rifle Winchester 44-40 that had belonged to her father and considered her options. She wasn't a killer, had never fired a shot in anger, but the documents in her saddlebags represented the only hope of bringing justice to a conspiracy that had already murdered federal agents and innocent civilians. The first rider was less than 200 yards away when she made her choice. The rifle shot echoed across the broken country like thunder, and the man toppled from his saddle with a cry of surprise and pain. She'd aimed for his shoulder rather than his heart, wanting to disable rather than kill, but in the confusion that followed, his companions assumed they were under attack by multiple shooters. The second rider wheeled his horse and spurred back toward the valley, clearly intending to summon help. Callie's second shot took him in the leg, sending him tumbling to the ground in a tangle of limbs and leather. The third man, showing more courage than sense, charged toward her position with his pistol drawn. She waited until he was close enough that missing would be impossible, then put a bullet through his gun hand. The pistol went flying, and the man's horse reared and threw him before bolting back toward the valley floor. In less than 2 minutes, she'd disabled 3 armed men without killing any of them. But she'd also announced her presence to anyone within 5 miles, and the sound of gunfire would bring Davies's men running like wolves to a kill. She mounted Dusty and rode hard toward the north, abandoning stealth for speed. Behind her, she could hear shouts and the sound of multiple horses as the pursuit organized itself. The game of cat and mouse had become a running battle, and she was outnumbered by men who knew the country and had no qualms about shooting first and asking questions later. But as she urged the old mare up a slope that would have challenged a mountain goat, Callie found herself thinking about the ledger in her saddlebags and the justice it represented. She'd crossed a line back there, had chosen to fight rather than hide, and the knowledge brought with it a strange sense of liberation. She was no longer the invisible ranch hand who'd stumbled into a conspiracy beyond her understanding. She was a woman with a mission, carrying evidence that could expose corruption at the highest levels of territorial government. And she was beginning to understand that sometimes the only way to serve justice was to become comfortable with violence. The mountains ahead offered both sanctuary and danger country, where a skilled rider could lose pursuit, but also terrain where a single mistake could prove fatal. As Dusty climbed toward the distant peaks, Callie clutched the reins with hands that no longer trembled, her eyes fixed on the horizon and the promise of justice that lay beyond it. The stolen ledger bounced against her back with every step, a tangible reminder of the trust Levi Cross had placed in her and the price he might have paid for gathering the evidence it contained. Whatever lay ahead, whether capture, death, or the remote possibility of success, she would face it with the knowledge that she'd chosen to fight for something larger than her own survival. The conspiracy had made her into a fugitive, but they'd also made her into something more dangerous than they could imagine, a woman with nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. The compass needle trembled in her palm, as if sensing the weight of the decision before her. Callie sat on a wind-scoured ridge 2 days north of Willow Creek, studying the terrain ahead and trying to reconcile the demands of survival with the promises she'd made to the dead and the living. Her father's compass had been a constant companion since childhood, its brass case worn smooth by countless hands that had sought direction in uncertain times. He'd carried it through the war, through the difficult years of Reconstruction, through the journey west that had eventually claimed both his life and her mother's. Now it pointed steadily toward magnetic north, indifferent to the moral complexities that made true direction so hard to find. The landscape spread before her like a map of impossible choices. To the east lay the safer route toward Denver-established roads, settlements where she could resupply, terrain that favored a single rider trying to avoid pursuit. But that path would take her through country where Davies had undoubtedly positioned more men, and every mile would bring fresh opportunities for ambush. To the west, the mountains rose in jagged peaks that promised both sanctuary and death. It was country where the Kellerman gang had operated for years, where they knew every canyon and hidden trail. But it was also where she might find the answers to questions that had plagued her since that night in the barn, questions about who Levi Cross really was, and whether the man she'd risked everything to help was worthy of the sacrifice. She'd been following the gang's trail for 2 days now, reading the signs they'd left in their haste to pursue her. Disturbed earth where horses had been pushed too hard, abandoned campsites that revealed careless confidence, and most telling of all, the occasional piece of correspondence that had fallen from carelessly secured saddlebags. The letters she'd recovered painted a picture of an organization under pressure. Davies was demanding results, threatening to cut off protection if the gang couldn't eliminate the threat posed by Cross's evidence. The territorial capital was asking uncomfortable questions about irregularities in law enforcement, and federal investigators were beginning to take notice of patterns that had previously escaped scrutiny. But mixed among the operational correspondence were personal letters that revealed another side of the story. Family photographs, letters from wives and children, documents that spoke of men who had once been something other than killers and thieves. The gang members weren't monsters, they were people who had made progressively worse choices until they found themselves trapped in a web of violence and corruption that offered no easy escape. It was this realization that had crystallized her current dilemma. The evidence in her saddlebags would certainly bring justice, but it would also destroy lives that might still be salvageable. Some of the men whose names appeared in the ledger were undoubtedly beyond redemption, but others seemed to have been caught up in events beyond their control. Her father's compass spun gently in her palm, seeking its magnetic truth with an accuracy that human judgment could never match. If only moral choices could be navigated with such precision, if the difference between right and wrong could be read from an instrument that pointed toward absolute truth rather than mere convention. The sound of approaching horses interrupted her contemplation. She pocketed the compass and moved to a position where she could observe the trail below without being seen. 3 riders were making their way along the valley floor, but these weren't the hard-faced gunmen she'd been avoiding for the past week. The leader was a woman, riding with the easy confidence of someone born to the saddle. She was perhaps 40 years old, with graying hair braided back in a practical style and clothes that spoke of prosperity without ostentation. The 2 men accompanying her had the look of bodyguard sailors, well-armed but deferential to her authority. Through her field glasses, Callie could see that the woman was studying the ground with the attention of an experienced tracker. She dismounted frequently to examine signs that others might have missed, following a trail that seemed to lead directly toward Callie's position. It was only when the woman looked up toward the ridge that Callie recognized her. Elena Kellerman, gang leader's widow, and according to the stolen ledger, the true power behind the organization that bore her late husband's name. She wasn't supposed to be here, in this remote country, pursuing a single fugitive with only 2 guards for protection. Unless she wasn't pursuing Callie at all. The realization struck with the force of revelation. Elena Kellerman was following the same trail that had led Callie into the mountains, the trail left by Levi Cross as he fled from Davies's men at the church. She was hunting the man who had betrayed her organization, and she was doing it personally rather than delegating the task to subordinates, which meant Cross was still alive, still free, and still somewhere in the mountain country ahead. Callie watched as Elena remounted and continued up the valley, her attention focused on signs invisible to untrained eyes. There was something almost ritualistic about her pursuit, as if she were following a code that demanded personal involvement in matters of honor and betrayal. The smart thing would be to let Elena pass, to avoid any contact with the most dangerous member of the conspiracy she was trying to expose. But as Callie studied the woman below, she began to see possibilities that a more cautious approach would miss. Elena Kellerman had been married to the gang's founder for 15 years. She knew its operations, its members, its connections to corrupt officials better than anyone alive. If she could be convinced to cooperate here, if circumstances could be arranged to make cooperation seem attractive, she could provide testimony that would be far more valuable than any written evidence. The approach would require careful planning and perfect timing. Elena was surrounded by loyal men who wouldn't hesitate to kill anyone who threatened their leader. But she was also operating in country where the advantages of numbers could be neutralized by superior position and knowledge of terrain. Callie spent the next hour observing Elena's party as they made their way through the valley below. The woman's tracking skills were impressive, but her guards were city men who looked uncomfortable in the wild country. More importantly, their attention was focused ahead, toward the trail they were following, rather than on the surrounding heights where an ambush might wait. As the afternoon wore on, Elena's party entered a narrow canyon where the walls rose steeply on both sides. It was perfect country for an ambush, multiple positions for a shooter, limited escape routes, and terrain that would make it difficult for mounted men to maneuver effectively. But Callie had no intention of killing Elena Kellerman. What she planned was far more dangerous than murder. She intended to have a conversation. The plan required precise timing and more courage than caution. She positioned herself on a ledge overlooking the narrowest part of the canyon, where Elena's party would be forced to ride single file between towering rock walls. From there, she could command the entire passage while remaining invisible to anyone approaching from below. When Elena and her guards reached the predetermined point, Callie stepped into view with her rifle trained on the canyon floor below. "Mrs. Kellerman," she called, her voice echoing off the stone walls, "I'd like a word with you." The reaction was immediate and predictable. The two guards reached for their weapons, while Elena raised her hand in a gesture that suggested both caution and command. "You're the woman Davies has been chasing," Elena said, her voice carrying clearly in the confined space. "The one who helped Cross escape, among other things. I'm also the one carrying evidence that could destroy your organization, hang your associates, and leave you facing a federal gallows." Callie kept her rifle steady, but pointed skyward, threatening, without being immediately hostile. "But I'm also someone who might be willing to discuss alternatives to mutual destruction." Elena studied her with intelligent eyes that missed very little. "What kind of alternatives?" "The kind that might benefit both of us. Your organization is finished, Mrs. Kellerman. Davies has overplayed his hand. Federal attention is focusing on territorial irregularities, and too many people know too much for the conspiracy to survive. The question is whether you want to go down with the ship or find a lifeboat." "And you're offering a lifeboat?" "I'm offering a conversation, one that might benefit us both."